Into the Verse. I am Beth Lesch, and I'm so excited to be joined here in the studio with Rabbi David Fohrman.
Hey, Beth, how are you? It's nice to see you.
Really good to see you too. Thanks for joining me, Rabbi Fohrman. We are here to discuss Parshat Vayishlach. And I want to clue you in and clue our listeners into what today's episode is going to be like. I call this a workshop. It is research in progress. I am coming to you, Rabbi Fohrman, and to our listeners with some interesting noticing, some things that just popped out at me. There's something here, but I haven't put it all together yet. I'm leaving the fun of that for this episode.
I'm all ears. Tell me what you noticed.
Let me start with the big picture of what I noticed. So Parshat Vayishlach tells the story of this epic dramatic reunion between Yaakov and Esau, between two brothers. And if you just think about the story in broad strokes, the themes that are at play, I think you'll notice, as I did, that it is eerily reminiscent of another story that we're going to read just a little bit later in the Torah. And when I talk about the broad themes, what I have in mind is a moment of reunion between brothers who have been apart for a long time. And there's also we'll call it a surprise ending. There's a sort of tone change in the middle where the reunion starts out with a sense of fear, intimidation. There's one party that sees itself as vulnerable and one party that's seen to be the one that is capable of doing harm. And in the end, you get this sort of climax where actually it becomes a loving, intimate embrace that ends in a kind of fraternal harmony.
Yeah, so I see where you're going here. What you're suggesting is this book of Genesis, in very broad strokes, has two stories of reunions and brothers, reunions where there's a lot of fear, and then that fear gives way to a sense of reconciliation, tears, that sort of thing. And what you must be referring to is the reunion not just of Yaakov and Esau, but the reunion of Yosef and his brothers. And I guess what you want to suggest is, does the Torah want us to connect them in some kind of way or to compare and contrast them? So tell me what you see in the text that makes you think that might be the case.
Yeah, right. So if it were just themes as we've laid out, that wouldn't be enough for me to think that there was an intentional, comparison being staged here for us. But there are a long list of phrases, words, some more unusual, some less unusual, that occur in both of these stories that make me think, this is not just my imagination. This is something that the text is suggesting to us. The one that caught my eye first, Rabbi Fohrman, is the language of Vayivater blank levado. And he was left alone, him all by himself.
In the Yaakov story, we've got that. Vayivater Yaakov levado, vayavek ishimo. This is the prelude to Yaakov's struggle with the angel. He's left all alone, and then a man materializes out of nowhere, and they have this struggle until morning. Where do you see something that reminds you that later on in the Joseph story?
Yeah, so in the Joseph story, who is it that's left alone? In the later story of Joseph and his brothers, you're going to find that very same phrase in the beginning of Vayigash. Yehuda is boldly stepping up to Yosef, who he doesn't yet know is Yosef, his long-lost brother. And he's just recounting the whole drama of what has happened up until this point. And here's the way that he characterizes his family. He says, Yesh lanu av zaken, we have a father who is old, v'yeled zekunim katan, and he has a child, his youngest child, who was born when he was older. V'achiv mate, his brother being Yosef, is presumed dead. Vayivater hu levado, and he alone, Binyamin, has been left alone, le'imo, to his mother. In other words, Binyamin is the only living, supposedly, child of Rachel.
Okay, that is pretty striking. So it's not like Benjamin is all alone physically in the way that Yaakov is all alone when this man shows up and struggles with him. But Benjamin is all alone in the sense that he's all that's left of Rachel. Okay.
Yeah, so you're right to point out that even though the language is the same in both cases, it seems like we're describing different dynamics. So similarities and differences. And when I first found this, it sort of confused me, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I thought, well, maybe I'm reading too much into it. That was until I started to see some more. The second more that I found, or the first more, is the word pleta. Pleta, an escapee, we might say, someone who manages to survive when others don't survive. This word, pleta, a very, very unusual word, occurs less than a handful of times in the entire Chumash. And the one time in the Yaakov story, Yaakov says to himself, Im yavo Esav el hamachane ha'achat. If Esav comes to the one camp, the Hikahu, and he strikes it, v'haya hamachane hanishar lefleta, then the camp that remains is going to be the escapee, is going to survive. What is he talking about? He was out of desperation, in desperate fear that Esau was going to approach with the 400 men and slaughter his entire family. He says, you know what I'll do? I'm going to take my family, divide them into two camps. And that way, if Esau does come upon them and he does slaughter, does do harm to the first camp, at the very least, the second camp will be able to escape unscathed.
Mm-hmm.
That word, pleta, that very unusual word, we also find in Yosef's mouth.
This is after Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and
That's
there's
right.
this reconciliation between them. So in that moment when he first says, hi, I'm Yosef, and he's explaining that they have nothing to fear, he's saying, God put me here to take care of you, and he's going to use that word lipleta. God wanted to make sure that it would be a remnant of you, and you'd not be entirely wiped out by the famine. Vayishlacheni Elokim lifnechem lasum lachem she'eris ba'aretz lahachayot lachem. God sent me to be the agent to give you life, lifleta gadola, so that there can be a lot left of you. There can be an important remnant of you. You shouldn't all die in famine. Va'ata lo atem shalachtem otihena ki ha'elokim. But it wasn't you that sent me here. It was God. And for that reason, I've become the ruler over all of Egypt. Okay, so you've got this word lifleta. And it's, by the way, worth noting that it's not just the word pleta, it's like the exact form of the word lifleta and lifleta. And I hazard a guess, Beth, that these are the only two lifletas in the 5 books of Moses.
These are the only 2 times in the Chumash, yes. And so too with vayivater. Vayivater, it's an unusual root, but that formulation of it, those are the only 2 cases where it occurs in the Chumash. And then to be paired later with levado is striking. So too here with this word fleta, it's paired with language of nishar, to remain, right? By Yaakov talks about the camp that remains, and Yosef says, I am a remnant, I am a she'arit somehow.
Okay, Beth, I'm all ears. What else did you find?
The next word that caught my eye is the word mincha. Okay, the word mincha, nowadays we use it to mean the afternoon davening. That's not the context here. It appears over and over again in the Torah to refer to a kind of sacrifice, a grain offering that's brought before God. That is also not the meaning as it appears in these 2 stories. It seems to refer to a gift, an offering, a gift, but similar to an offering that might be brought before God, a gift from a vulnerable party to a powerful party that is meant to appease and meant to bring favor. Where do I see the word mincha appearing in each story?
Well, in the Yaakov story, you have Yaakov's idea that he wants to send a mincha, a gift, to Esav in hopes of appeasing him. He says, Achapra panav b'mincha holechet lefanai, acharei ken era panav ulai yisa panai. Vatavor hamincha al panav. He says, I'm going to give him a mincha, this gift that's going to go before me. And that is right before his fateful encounter with the angels. And as it happens, Yaakov also insists, the same Yaakov, insists on sending a mincha in the Joseph story. There's also, as you point out, Beth, a powerful person in the Joseph story. That person is this disguised, unnamed, high Egyptian official. And Yaakov is intimidated of him because he's holding on to Shimon at this point, right? And Yaakov feels the need to appease him. He says to the brothers, fine, if you're going to go back to him, but make sure that you send a mincha to the person.
Yeah, first it's Vayikhu Hanashim et Mincha. They take it. That's in verse 15. Then in 25, it's Vayachinu et Mincha. And then they finally bring it to him in 26. Vayavo Yosef habaita, vayavi'u lo es mincha asher biyadam habaita, vayishtachavu lo arza. And they bow down to him.
And while we're at it, I might just say the Vayishtachvu lo arza is going to be another connection, right?
Yes.
Because isn't it the case that it's not just the brothers who bow before Joseph when they give him the mincha, but after Yaakov gives Esav the mincha, when he finally goes to meet his brother, right, he also bows to the ground.
There's actually a whole chain of bowing. Yaakov bows first, Vayishtachavu arza. He does it 7 times as he approaches his brother, ad gishto, ad achiv. And then all of the women and all of the children follow suit.
And similarly, the brothers are giving this mincha to Joseph, are going to bow to Joseph as well. So just to take stock, you've got the delivery of the mincha followed by bowing in 2 stories. You have the Vayivatar Hulavato connection, and you've got the Lifleta connection. And in general, there are these 2 stories of these brothers that are coming to meet each other, and both seem like these fearful, very difficult reunions, and then things kind of work out. So it does sound like the language of one story is being borrowed by the other. You've convinced me that the language seems to be strong enough that if I'm thinking about the Joseph story, I am thinking about the Yaakov story in the back of my mind as I listen to these echoes.
So, Rabbi Fohrman, I'll say that I remember very early on when I began learning with you, you talked about textual analysis being like a form of archaeology, where you find a single dinosaur bone. Say you're, out there in the desert on a hot day doing your excavating, and you say, is this a dinosaur bone? I'm not sure. Maybe it's just a piece of pottery. It's a bit hard to tell. Maybe it's a rock. If it really is a dinosaur bone, there's liable to be other pieces here as well. There should be a whole skeleton somewhere in the surroundings, and all I have to do is take care in unearthing it, and then that'll validate my findings, after the fact. That is, for me, the mincha was that dinosaur bone, was that initial dinosaur bone. Is it a dinosaur bone or is it a rock? And once I went searching around that, there was a whole scroll of words that I started to find between the 2 stories, all uniting around this theme of what happens when you have a vulnerable brother or brothers gearing up to have an intimidating encounter with another brother that they think might do them harm. What does that chain of words look like? So yira, vayiru, vayar, in both cases, the vulnerable party is described as experiencing fear in anticipation of the encounter. Vayigash, the ultimate encounter, is described as, in the language of Vayigash or Vayigshu, it is an encounter, literally. As we discussed, there's the Vayishtachavu arza, there's bowing down to the ground. When they finally do reunite, you find language of vayipol, falling, upon al tzvarav, on one's neck. In other words, this embrace, just overcome with emotion, falling upon one's neck and crying, vayivku.
So the threefold theme, A, to fall on the neck, B, to kiss, and C, to cry, right? So that occurs in both stories. It occurs in the Yaakov story when he meets his brother, and occurs in the next generation when the brothers meet Joseph. So what I would say is one of the tricky things about this, right? You've uncovered what I might say is a grand pattern. In other words, the reason why it's grand is because you have a pattern spanning multiple chapters here in the Joseph story, and a little bit less text in the Jacob story, but also a lot of text. I suspect that each of these connections that you'll find, if you zero in on each of them, you'll find that there's aspects of it which you haven't fully explicated yet, and there's other aspects of the pattern in each of these little isolated places that they appear. And as if you would go in and do that work, you might find yourself in a position where you could at least understand a little bit more carefully what the meaning of those isolated connections are. And by doing that, ultimately, you might be able to get to a theory about the grand meaning of how all those connections come together. That would kind of be my game plan here. I don't know if we have enough time to do all of that. That feels like about 5 or 6 hours of work, but we can jump in and try it a little bit. There's a few things that I noticed with each of these. Why don't we begin with the first one that you found? So the first connection that you found was the Vayivater Yaakov Levado connection, right? That Yaakov is left all alone, and there's this man who struggles with him until morning. And that you found was connected to Vayivater hu levado le'imo, that Binyamin was all that was left to his mother, and his father loved him. Okay, so what do you do with that connection? So one way to think about it is you can try to understand who matches up with who, and then what you can try to do is like literally superimpose one story on the other, and as you do so, phantom elements of one story may emerge. In other words, if I have two things that go on top of each other, imagine these transparencies, and they're meant to layer on top of each other. The pictures are not exactly the same, but certain aspects of them are. Then layering them on top of each other can reveal phantom elements of one story. In other words, you say, well, there's all this stuff here in this story that doesn't seem to fit that story. Is it really the case that it doesn't fit? Or are there phantom elements of the other story that actually do fit, at least implicitly, the thing that it's being overlaid with? Let me show you what I'm talking about here,
Yeah.
right?
I'm getting excited.
Okay. So let's go to Vayivater Yaakov Levado, right? Yaakov here matches up with who?
So Yaakov is alone. He's the one who's alone. And then his parallel is Binyamin. Binyamin is the one who's being described as being left alone.
So, okay, so Benjamin is our Jacob character in the second story. Now, here's where my brain goes. My brain says, well, let's look at the first story and ask what happens. Vayivater Yaakov Levado, what happens when Yaakov is all alone? So, Vayeavek ish imo ad alot hashachar. A mysterious man comes and starts struggling with him until morning. So, what I would ask you, Beth, is does that thing in the second story when Joseph was gone and now all that's left is Benjamin to his mother, right? So it doesn't say the words Vayavek ishimo ad alot hashachar in the Joseph story. There is no man struggles with them until morning. But I ask you, Beth, is it possible that there is a phantom in the Joseph story? There's a phantom man that comes and struggles with Benjamin, so to speak, until the morning. And who would that phantom man be?
Into the Verse will be right back, but first, I want to let you know that if you're enjoying this podcast, it is just the tip of the iceberg of what Aleph Beta has to offer. On alephbeta.org, you'll find our world famous animated videos. We have videos on parsha, holidays, big ideas, and so much more. With a premium subscription, you get access to 600 plus hours of content. So sign up today. And as a special gift for Into the Verse listeners, we'll give you the first month free when you sign up for an annual subscription. Just use the coupon code ITVFREE. Now back to this week's episode.
But I ask you, Beth, is it possible that there is a phantom in the Joseph story? There's a phantom man that comes and struggles with Benjamin, so to speak, until the morning. And who would that phantom man be?
So if I'm thinking what you're thinking, if you're thinking what I'm
Yeah.
thinking, I wonder if that person might be Joseph.
I think it is Joseph. Tell me, why do you think that Joseph might be the man who comes and struggles with Benjamin until the morning?
Yeah, so we have to trace it step by step. The first thing you have to realize is that Yaakov, in his story, is described as being alone, but he's not really alone. We find out in the very next verse that actually there's a man there with him, right? So too, in the description of Binyamin. Binyamin is described as being alone, which is immediately prefaced by a mention of his brother who is dead, but his brother is not really dead. His brother is actually alive and is actually right there in the room with him, just no one realizes it at that moment.
So you're picking up on a really interesting point that I hadn't even considered, but I think that you're exactly right. In other words, one of the strange aspects about the Jacob story is that there's a grammatical problem in that story. You can't say Vayivater Yaakov levado vayavek ishimo. Those words don't make sense. If Yaakov was really all alone, who is this man who's struggling with him? Obviously, he wasn't alone. It must be. Yaakov's perception is that he's all alone, but he in fact isn't alone because there's this man that's actually there that's struggling with him. Similarly, there is an issue of perception in this story too, because brother's perception is that Benjamin is all alone and that he's all that's left to his mother because Achiv mate, his brother has died. But the very person that Judah is talking to when he says Achiv mate is in fact the brother that Judah has supposed is dead. It's Joseph, and Joseph hasn't died. So if Joseph is the man, right, is right there beside him. So in both cases, there is it's the case that neither the Benjamin nor the Jacob character is really all alone. There in fact is an unperceived man by either of them that makes them not alone. Now, Beth, if we just unfurl the implications anymore, if in the second story the man was Joseph, his brother, who does that make you start thinking the man might be in the Jacob story?
It makes me wonder if that man might be Esav.
Exactly. And hence we have Chazal. The sages are coming and tell us that the person that Yaakov struggled with was Sar Shel Esav, was in fact some sort of angel that represented Esav. Where would they get such a ludicrous notion? Could be that the sages were aware of this intertextual parallel and did the same algebra that you and I just did, right? And said, oh, wow, this is parallel to the Benjamin story. Benjamin wasn't all alone. He had a man next to him. That man was his brother, right? It sure sounds like Jacob wasn't all alone either. He had a man next to him, and that man was some sort of heavenly representative of his brother, right?
Right.
It's interesting because before the revelation, as you pointed out, there's a marked ambivalence about what it would be like to meet them. And there's reason for that ambivalence. I mean, there was deception going back in both stories. There's anger, there's bad feelings, right? And so what's really going to happen? So I go back to the question I asked you before. Vayivater Yaakov levado, we were talking about this phantom aspect of the story, that Yaakov is all alone when vayavek ishimo ad alot hashachar, when a man struggled with him until the morning. I go back to my original question. If in the Yaakov case, there was a man who struggled, a divine man who struggled with Yaakov until the morning hours, in the Yosef story, is there a divine man who struggles with Benjamin until the morning? And who would that be? Now, you said that's Joseph, but I can challenge you and say, but Joseph's a nice guy. He's going to reveal himself. Does Joseph ever struggle with Benjamin until the morning?
He certainly struggles with him. I mean, right before he reveals himself, that's the whole drama. Joseph presents as a terrifying figure who has deceived Binyamin. He sets him up. He puts the goblet into his cup. He frames him, and then he says, I'm going to keep you as a slave forever.
Exactly. No greater struggle than that, right? So here is this divine messenger, but there's this struggle between them, right? Before there's this revelation that things are going to be okay. Right? Notice Vayaveki Moshe ad alot hashachar, and he struggled with him until dawn. Take a look at chapter 44, verse 3. When exactly did Joseph start pursuing Benjamin to try to catch up to him?
Wonderful. So haboker or, it was morning time.
It was dawn. Dawn had just broken. So in one story, the struggle goes until dawn, and another story, the struggle starts at dawn. Right? Yep. When Joseph goes and runs after him. So what you really seem to be seeing is two stories in which there is a Jacob character in one story. In the next generation, there's a Benjamin character who seems to be the next generation of Jacob. And they both have a similar struggle. And it's sort of interesting because if you think about Joseph's feelings towards Benjamin, despite the fact that Joseph is capturing Benjamin, right? Deep down, what's Joseph's real feelings about Benjamin?
He loves him.
He loves
we,
him.
we know something about this story that Binyamin doesn't know at all, which is that what
Exactly.
seems like aggression is actually an act of love and protection.
And it makes
Which
you wonder
makes
whether
you
the
wonder
same
what's
thing
going on with the
with
angel.
Esau.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, when Esau comes to greet him with 400 men, imagine how intimidated you would be if you were the brothers and you realize that here's this brother that you deceived, and now he's in charge of the world, and he's got this whole coterie in Egypt with his 400 men. You're terrified of those 400 men, just like Jacob is terrified about Esau's 400 men. But just as in the second story, we know something that the brothers don't know, which is that, in fact, deep down, Joseph really loves Benjamin and wants nothing more than to love him and hug him and kiss him. Isn't it fascinating? Is it really the case that Jacob managed to appease him? I mean, the appeasement in the Joseph story didn't work any well. Was it the Mincha that changed Joseph's mind? He didn't care about them. It wasn't the Mincha. And it wasn't the Mincha in the Jacob story either. In both cases, you think it's the Mincha. But it could be that what's really going on is that the second story is shedding light on the first, telling us how to read Esau, which is that at some deep level, Esau was a brother. Right. And yes, you can deceive and yes, you can hurt, but there is this sort of undying sense that if I could only hug you and kiss you, then somehow reconciliation could be possible. And therefore, it's kind of ambiguous what those 400 men are. It's possible that those 400 men are aggressive, but it's also possible that those 400 men are just his coterie. Like he's a rich guy. He's established himself. He's the new Prince of Seir. Esau has made something out of himself. He's got 400 men now. Sure, in both cases, there's some hard feelings, but underneath those hard feelings, there's somebody who is willing to hug you and willing to kiss you because there's kind of an undying brotherly love. And maybe there's a note of hope in both of these stories, which is that, you can go through really tough things in your family and you can think that there's a painful, terrible feud based upon things that brothers should not do to brothers, right? There was people threw Joseph in a pit and deceived Esau, and there's all these feelings like I'd like to kill him, and Esau is like, yeah, I'm going to kill him, and those feelings are real. But sometimes human beings are creatures that have contradictory feelings or layers of feelings, and the aggression is a superficial layer, and sometimes underneath that, if you can get below that, there's still some sort of love and some sort of connection. And what the hopeful parts of these stories is that, reconciliation is possible. You can take that chance. And it could be that your fearfulness comes because you don't recognize who your brother has become during this time, but it's not necessarily the case that they have as aggressive a stance as you might suspect that they have. And therefore, the possibility of connection, with this new version of your brother could be real. So to me, that's what I mean by as you begin to look at these micro connections, we've only looked at one of the Vayivater Hu Levado, but you see how rich it is once you begin to really look at it and mine it for its implications. So Beth, I know we're trying to record a podcast here, so maybe we'll leave it at this for now and challenge your readers and say, each one of these connections, there's a whole rich field of opportunity for you as you look at the idea of the pleta. What jumps out at you? How do you see that as enriching your view of one or both stories? Can you see the phantom side of each story emerge as you look at the pleta? As you look at the final reconciliation where they fall on each other's necks and they cry and they kiss, right? And you begin to compare what happens there. Again, do we begin to see a larger picture emerging? And I think we do. That's the really fascinating possible work that intertextual analysis allows for us. And I'd be really thrilled to hear if your audience comes up with any fascinating observations. But thank you, Beth, for introducing this stuff to me.
You can, as always, leave us a voice note. There's information about that in the description of the podcast, and let's keep it going. This is work that we can all share.